Boldwood presents Takeover, written by Edie Baylis and read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. 1965. Ted Matthews stared at his wife sitting sullenly in the floral-patterned armchair. He understood Barbara's disappointment. But what else could they do? Being as their daughter had been so lax as to get herself in the family way by a good-for-nothing layabout. Ted smoothed his hand over his thinning brill-creamed hair, a habit he'd always been prone to when tense or nervous. And right now he was both. Plus he was angry. Really angry. They hadn't raised Linda to behave like this. She knew the rules, yet she'd broken them in the worst way. At 15, she couldn't even marry that piece of scum to save her reputation either. Not that he'd have sanctioned that in a month of Sundays. Sighing, he glanced up at the ceiling of his sitting room, and although the sound was muffled, he could still make out his daughter sobbing from the bedroom upstairs. Linda had been like that ever since the man had arrived to take the baby. Yet she'd known it had to happen, and that it was happening today. That's why Barbara had carefully spelled out to her time and time again not to get attached to the child. Ted shrugged. It was the best thing all round. For everyone. He yanked at the ring pull of his can of special brew. It might only be 4 p.m, but he'd be in the pub by now for a well-deserved clocking off pint if he hadn't had to take unpaid leave to sort this out. Still, at least it was done now. He glanced at the thick envelope on the coffee table. That would go some way towards putting this right. Shame a part of it had to go to that scumbag, but if that's what it took to remove the fool from Linda's life for good, then so be it. Ted's eyes tracked over to the carriage clock perched on the mantelpiece. That thing would be here any minute. Or he'd better be. He made it very clear in the message he'd sent what time Bedworth should be here, and the piece of dirt best not be late. Grabbing the envelope, Ted counted out the amount he'd decided on and stuffed it into another envelope. He placed the smaller envelope on top of the sideboard, making sure he stuffed the larger one into a drawer. Barbara's eyes burned into him the whole time, and Ted bit back the urge to shout at her. She knew as well as he did there was nothing else they could have done. They weren't in the position to bring up another young'un. Despite him being a hard-working man, they barely had enough to keep things together as it was. But everything they did have, he'd supplied. No handouts for Ted Matthews and his family, thank you. Well, that bastard Bedworth wouldn't screw up his daughter's life any more, and at least now Linda could carry on. There was no way she'd have been able to do that had she kept the child. It might be the 1960s, but women were still ostracised about this sort of thing, and he wasn't having that. Not to his Linda, nor to any of his other kids by association either. The sharp tap of the door jolted Ted from his thoughts, and he quickly got to his feet. Right, let's get this filth out of our lives, shall we? Barbara wrung her hands, her heart already sinking with the prospect. She hoped Ted wouldn't lose his temper. She knew he was cross. They all were, but he didn't achieve anything. She bristled as the figure of Thomas Bedworth sauntered into her small living room. His faded shirt looked scruffier than usual underneath his moth-eaten leather jacket. "All right, Mrs. M," Tom drawled. A cockeyed smile plastered across his face. "Linda okay, is she?" "Don't you dare ask how Linda is, you prick," Ted spat. "You know why I summoned you here this afternoon, so don't start getting fly." "All right, keep your hair on." Thomas smirked, sitting down uninvited in one of the armchairs. Who did Ted Matthews think he was? Bloody royalty. "The child has now gone, so being as this business is over, I want you out of my daughter's life," Ted barked. Despite promising himself not to give away any outward signs of rage, he knew his hands were visibly shaking, which irritated him further. "I should have stopped this from the start, rather than give you the benefit of the doubt. I might have known you had no respect for my daughter." Barbara's hands twisted together in her lap. "Ted, Don't make a scene. Make a scene? This waste of space gets our daughter pregnant, buggers off and then strolls in months later thinking he's the bee's knees. I'll give him the bee's knees. He's not fit for anything, let alone our Linda, Ted spat, eyeing Thomas Bedworth malevolently. Your daughter didn't have a problem opening her legs for me, Mr. Matthews, Tom sneered. It takes two to tango, you know. Ted lurched across the room. You fucking little shit. Ted! Barbara screeched. Stop this! This is supposed to resolve the situation, not worsen it! Breathing heavily, Ted stuck his finger in his collar to loosen it and rolled his shoulders. Red-faced, he stared at the sneering mug of Thomas Bedworth. I want you out of my house and out of my daughter's life. But firstly, I want assurance that you'll never darken my door again. You will have nothing to do with this family in the future. Is that understood? Tom bit down on his bottom lip in false consideration. That was perfectly fine by him. He had no intention of seeing Linda again, and certainly never planned to see the brat. Now she'd finally popped it out. As it was, it had taken him far too long to get in her knickers, and even then the event was a major letdown, like shagging a corpse. And then after that once, the stupid bitch had gone all frigid on him. That once was all it took, yet he was the one being treated like a prized twat. Bear in mind that child is mine too, and you have offered me no say about what has been arranged. Tom eyed Ted carefully. I could take umbrage to that. Ted grabbed the smaller envelope from the sideboard. That's why I said you'd get plenty of reason to stay the hell away. He chucked the envelope into Thomas's lap, not trusting himself to get close enough to hand it to the man. There's $3,000 in there. More than enough to make you fuck the hell off away from here, I presume. Tom blew through his teeth in appreciation. He knew a payout was on the cards. It was the only reason he'd shown up. But he hadn't expected this kind of brass. He could do a lot with this. A hell of a lot. What an absolute bonus. Take the money and promise me that you'll keep clear of my daughter. Tom got to his feet, grinned at Barbara and then at Ted. You have my word. I won't be going near Linda. Trust me. Your word, like you, means nothing. But I hope for all our sakes that you honour it. Now get out of my house, Ted spat. Chapter 1. 1995. And you think this is the best timing? Gary Stoker looked at his father, then between each of his three brothers. His thick eyebrows furrowed. They won't appreciate being disturbed. Not today. It's a bit inconsiderate. Seb Stoker rolled his eyes. He wasn't in the best of moods, having been disturbed from a rare evening off. But after being called in for this impromptu meeting, all they were doing was procrastinating. If anyone could find an issue with something, anything, it was Gary. Out of all his brothers, Gary was always the one to flap, looking for problems that most of the time weren't there. The bloke should have been born a woman with his penchant for overthinking. He fixed his father with the same look the older man was giving all of his sons. Personally, I don't give a rat's arse if it's some bird's birthday. If something needs doing, then it needs doing. What I'm more bothered about is why we're giving Reynold the heads up. It's called mutual respect. Mal Stoker pursed his lips and frowned. Still attractive even in his mid-50s, his face was an older version of his eldest son's. Hard lines, strong jaw and cheekbones. By a long shot, Sebastian was the most able of all his offspring. But then Seb had been raised to take over the reins of the business and inherit it in its entirety one day. However, if there was one thing he would change about his firstborn, it was that hot temper and streak of impetuousness, which, if not kept in check, was detrimental. But if it wasn't for the Reynolds, we'd be numero uno around here rather than sharing that title. So why should we help them? Neil griped. Mal sighed. You're being short-sighted. All of you. Think about it. If what I've heard is correct, then whoever's running the Aurora is treading on thin ice. Mal didn't know anything for definite, but he got the distinct gist that these people at the Aurora were of a completely different mentality. He'd heard bad things about their recently opened hodgepodge of a club, encompassing a dubious gambling den with fixed odds, along with a strip club and brothel. And the word had it that their girls were treated unfairly too, underpaid and not looked after. No one liked gaffs that treated birds like shit. Where he came from, that sort of thing wasn't the ticket. Mal might, along with thousands of others, have come from a basic working-class background in a less salubrious part of the city. He might have had his fingers in several pies and lived on the other side of the law, but he had his morals, and didn't take kindly to anyone who possessed none, especially when it came to women or kids. Seb sighed loudly. Pulling his cigarettes from his pocket, he lit one, slowly exhaling a curl of smoke. The Aurora is a bag of shit, and could never be a threat to any of us on the strip. He cracked his knuckles absent-mindedly. From what I've gathered, it's a bunch of no-hope and northern gypwhacks trying their luck, that's all. They'll amount to fuck all. Mal smiled coldly and folded his arms across his still well-built muscular chest. Well, probably. But what none of you are taking on board is that any interference, however fruitless, is still interference, and interference upsets the equilibrium. In fact, Lem Reynold was the person Mal had aspired to be, and it had been mainly down to close watching of how Len had achieved his station that had prompted him to follow suit. He'd watched from the wings as Len had risen from a mere runner in one of the city firms to running his very own firm and owning his own gaff by the age of 28. Len's firm had quickly gained pace and trampled all but a handful of the other firms in the city. Mal had seen enough to know this was what he wanted too, and he'd achieved it. But he'd always made sure he stayed to his own territory and didn't encroach on Lem Reynold's patches. That way they coexisted with little hassle and no bad feeling. Being 7 years younger, he'd missed the gravy train of the flourishing black market at the end of the war, which Len had used as a means of a stepping stone to the city firms. But by keeping in the shadows, he'd learnt a lot regardless. Mal looked around his nicely equipped office at the back of the Royal Peacock, his casino, and nodded to himself in silent acknowledgement. Both he and Len had done all right for themselves. As I've said, I have a mutual understanding with Reynold where the Orchid and its subsidiaries are concerned. We don't tread on each other's toes, and we get the same respect in return. Seb tapped his ash into the large crystal ashtray in the centre of the round table. That's as may be. But it's prudent to act on small hints rather than assume they belong to the 75% of stuff which never amounts to anything, Mal interrupted. But to go out of our way to pal up with the Orchid, Seb countered, not ecstatic that his father believed his logical processes so inept that he should need extra tuition like some backward kid. Mal knew his boys would find speaking to Reynold about those clowns from the Aurora an issue, but they didn't understand. The new generation was a different ilk to those of his and Lem Reynold's day. The Stokers and Lem Reynold might well be rivals on the casino strip, and were far from the best of friends, but they went back a long way. It's called manners, he said sharply. Seb hasn't got many of those, Andrew laughed, his mischievous green eyes, which all the Stoker men apart from Gary possessed, sparkling. Mal placed his hands on the table. Reynold must be told what I've heard, and I want him told tonight. If it were me, I'd want to know, and I'm pretty certain he would do me the same courtesy. We may be rivals in business, but we're not fucking enemies. He looked at each of his sons in turn once again. I'm not suggesting you drag him away from his daughter's celebrations. Speak to John Maynard. He'll inform Reynold, but our part will be done in a timely fashion. Seb sighed. OK, you're the boss. Mal grinned. Yes, I am. So go to the Orchid. Tell Maynard what I've told you, and then I want to meet with Reynold. Seb nodded and pushed his chair away from the table. I best go and get myself changed then. He was still not convinced Reynold would be happy about him turning up to his daughter's birthday bash, to say there was a bunch of saddos trapping off about muscling in on their jointly split patches. But there could be a silver lining. There would be lots of pretty women in the violet orchid, and being as his evening off had been scuppered, he may as well see if he could make up for it. Samantha Reynold picked up the new clip-in flower, the type she religiously wore every year on her birthday, and one of many similar ones her father had bought for her over the years. She studied the exquisite hand-embroidered silk, its details exactly replicating the intricate pattern and form of the flower. The perfectly shaped lighter-coloured petals and sepals positioned behind the darker central lip and throat showcased the splash of yellow stigma in the centre beautifully. Green leaves surrounded the flower, framing the rich violets and purples of the orchid. Clipping the flower into her hair, Sam smiled at her reflection in her bedroom mirror. It had been a good day so far. A lot of people would prefer to not have spent their birthday at work, but she loved her job. A graphic designer for a small but on-trend design shop in the centre of the city, she enjoyed the creative and varied work. She'd relished the recent fact-finding trip down to London for her latest project, a storefront and rebranding for an eclectic interior design company on the King's Road in Chelsea. The meeting with the company's creative directors had gone well, and the best part was that they'd loved her ideas. She hoped to open her own design company eventually, and the way things were going with her work portfolio, that day might not be too far off. Plus, the money she would earn from this latest commission would put her just where she needed to move forward with that. Of course, Sam's father would fund her business quicker than she could snap her fingers at. He'd been offering it ever since she'd first qualified, but Sam wanted to achieve it herself. And much as it would be easier to let her father bankroll the whole thing, it was important she was the one to make it happen. Her father had already done so much for her. Like this place. Sam gazed around the expanse of her balconied bedroom and beamed widely. Although it had been sad moving from her small house on the outskirts of town, which in her early 20s she'd worked hard to secure a mortgage for, this place, well, in addition to being beautiful, it was perfectly located, so she'd reluctantly but gratefully accepted the offer of living in the sought-after, newly developed regeneration around Gas Street Basin. Her father had purchased the gorgeous apartment in the Symphony Court shortly after its completion earlier in the year, and it afforded her the luxury of city centre living, plus it was within walking distance to work. It was also on the doorstep of a plethora of restaurants, bars and entertainment venues. She even had her own balcony overlooking the canal waterway. Yes, it was all good. Her new apartment was amazing, and work was getting busier and better every day. But tonight, she wouldn't think about work. She would put her all into the party waiting for her at the casino, the party that was so important to both of her parents. It was a bit of a long-standing family joke. Every year since she could remember, from a toddler, right up to now at 30 years old, she had been surprised by a party in her honour. When Liam had phoned, suggesting drinks before dinner, she'd had a good inkling they wouldn't be going to dinner or drinks at all, but to her father's casino, like she did every single year. Sam clearly remembered all the parties her father had thrown for her, like the one for her 13th birthday. All her friends from school were invited, and they'd all been allowed a proper drink from the bar for the first time. It might have only been a purposefully watered-down half-filled flute of champagne, but how grown-up had she felt, dolled up in her best clothes, sipping from the crystal-clear glass. That party was the talk of the school for months afterwards. How lucky she was to have a father who owned a casino, and how cool her family was. But the party she remembered most was her 18th. That was the night her uncle was killed. Not that she was aware of that until the next day. As well as the sadness of Uncle Jimmy's death, it had broken her heart to think her parents had managed to go the whole night of her party, hiding their pain. Her mother from losing her brother, and her father from losing his best friend. Purely not to spoil her evening. Her parents were the best, and she felt blessed to have been so lucky. But she wasn't stupid. She had a good idea what her father did behind the scenes of his shiny casino. Not everything, but a lot more than her mother did. There was more going on there than a bunch of shiny roulette tables and immaculately dressed croupiers. But did it bother her? Of course not. Her father was her father, and always had been. He'd been the one to give her piggybacks, the one to dry her eyes and make her feel like the most special person in the world. He'd been the one to cheer her up when she'd been sad, given her something to aim for. And he'd also given her the greatest gift of all, the ability to believe in herself. Sam hoped now she'd reached the big milestone of being 30, that she'd achieved that well. And once she'd fulfilled her dream of owning her very own design business, her life would be perfect. Hearing the intercom buzz, Sam glanced up. That must be Liam. Taking one last glimpse in the mirror, she grabbed her clutch bag and rushed through the door. Getting into Liam's Audi, Sam smiled. It would be quicker to walk, you know. The orchid's only round the corner. Liam grinned, his eyes sparkling. Yeah, but your father insisted. You haven't forgotten this is supposed to be a surprise. Sam laughed with delight. Of course I haven't. It was so silly. Everyone knew that she knew, but who cared? It never stopped it being any less special. It was less than a minute before Liam pulled up outside the violet orchid. He reached across and squeezed Sam's hand. You look stunning. Thank you, Sam said, hastily moving to open the passenger door. Liam was another story. She knew her father was hoping they'd become more than good friends because he liked the man. She liked Liam too, but there was something missing. OK, so they'd shared the odd night together in the past, and Liam had made no secret that he'd liked their relationship to move that way on a permanent basis. But Sam was happy enough on her own and wanted it to stay like that. Throwing his keys to the parking attendant, Liam placed Sam's arm through his as they walked up the steps to the entrance. Evening, Miss Reynold. Miss Taylor? The doorman nodded as he held open the large doors to the reception area. Smiling, Sam walked across the plush carpet to deposit her jacket with the cloakroom attendant and glanced at her reflection in the mirrored panels of the casino reception. Not bad for 30, she thought with an impish smile. The slinky cream satin dress she'd chosen for the evening accentuated the shape of her slender figure and set off the dark waves of her hair perfectly, the long glossy tresses cascading halfway down the criss-cross strap detail of her backless gown. She gently touched the large 3-carat centrepiece diamond of the necklace resting perfectly against the hollow of her neck, another of the presents her parents had handed her this morning. Ready? Liam grinned, his hazel eyes twinkling as he nodded towards the double doors, the usual hustle and bustle of the casino unusually quiet. Remember to look suitably surprised. Sam arched one eyebrow, as if I wouldn't. She readied herself as Liam pushed the heavy double doors open. Chapter 2. Standing to the side of her husband, Gloria Reynolds smoothed down the dark pink skirt of her tailored suit and fidgeted. She eyed the array of perfectly dressed, young and beautiful women surrounding them and hoped she didn't look like mutton dressed as lamb. Never one for the limelight, over the years she'd made a consistent effort to take a back seat where her involvement in Len's casino was concerned, only ever venturing into the glitzy world her husband frequented when she really had to, or when it was important for him. She'd been there when he'd first opened the Violet Orchid, and although it had been a huge source of pride that Len had progressed so well with his business to warrant purchasing a casino by the age of 28, this world of fancy clothes, big spenders and overconfidence was as far removed from what she found comfortable as it could be. However, even Gloria's crippling nervousness of being surrounded by all these people, so vastly different to herself, could never do anything to dilute the love and pride in the man she'd married. She studied Len's side profile as he towered above her, his concentration honed on when their daughter would burst through the doors. Devilishly handsome, even at 68, he cut an impressive figure in his tailor-made tuxedo, his physique still remarkably good. Gloria had never dreamt a man such as Len would have been interested in her. Growing up in Erdington, they'd lived in the same road of back-to-back terraces. Len was good pals with her older brother, Jimmy, and a frequent visitor to their little family home. It was only when she reached 12 that she'd developed a private fascination for the dapper, confident and grown-up 17-year-old Len had by then become. At 12, the difference between her and someone of 17 or 18 was immense. Plus, after working odd jobs for local firms, both Len and her brother had progressed into something called runners. Proper jobs, not errand boys for the local butcher or anything like that. Gloria never knew exactly what runners were, because both Jimmy and Len always stopped talking whenever she was in earshot. But whatever it was, her parents hadn't been too happy about it. She remembered the many ear bashings Jimmy received from their mother about his line of work. Her mother had changed her tune somewhat when Jimmy began bringing home more money in a week than their father earned in a month, and soon after that, Gloria noticed her parents found themselves more accepting of her brother's trade. Throughout all of this, Gloria successfully managed to keep her fascination for Len to herself. This was probably best, being as her brother and Len attracted a constant stream of older girls a lot prettier and more grown up than her. Gloria smiled to herself as Len placed his arm around her and gestured towards the waiting photographer. She hated photos and had never been particularly photogenic, so her mother had always liked to say. But turning, she reluctantly smiled for the press. No, her fascination for Leonard Reynold had started over half a century ago and hadn't waned since. She'd been unable to believe it. After she turned 16, Leonard suddenly asked her to the pictures. Gloria had been convinced it was a wind-up. Flushing crimson, she looked around for a bunch of Len's mates, including her brother, to jump from their hiding places and laugh hysterically at her gullibility for thinking it could ever be a remote possibility that someone like Len Reynold would be interested in a shrew-like boring person such as her, Gloria Maynard. But Len was very much interested, and within the year they were married. Not only were they married, but with Len's fantastic earnings, they'd even bought a house, only a tiny one around the corner from her parents, but they'd bought it all the same. Everyone else she knew, every single person, rented, yet they owned theirs. On top of this, Len was progressing fast in the firm he worked for. He'd done well, as had her brother. Gloria never asked too much about what they did. That was men's business. All she knew was, as well as being gorgeous, kind and funny, Len loved her and treated her like a princess. After 10 years, Len had his own company, his very own business, with her brother Jimmy as his right-hand man. He'd even risked every penny they had buying a building in the city centre. It was a run-down dump of a place, but within a year, and a lot of hard graft, it was a fully functioning, sparkling casino. The very one she was standing in right now. Len's firm and casino had gone from strength to strength, and his business empire had expanded fourfold. Len had been one of the youngest men ever to own such a fabulous club, and had set the precedent for the area, spawning several other casinos and clubs to spring up around him. But the Violet Orchid was by far the most glamorous, popular and successful one in the city. Of course, they'd bought a bigger house, the first of 3, and with money being no object, Gloria used her time organising the decoration and furnishing, which she enjoyed immensely. But this day was the most important. It was this day 30 years ago when her life had become complete, the day that marked when her darling daughter had arrived. A flicker of sadness passed over Gloria's face. It was also the 12th anniversary of the day that her rock of a brother had died. Suddenly hearing hushed whispers, Gloria knew Samantha was about to appear. Clutching onto Len's arm, she stood in readiness. "Surprise!" the chorus echoed, along with a cacophony of exploding party poppers, flashbulbs, and the sudden thumping of music. Gloria smiled, watching Sam making her way over the thickly carpeted floor of the casino towards her. Tears pricked her eyes. Sam was wearing the flower, the orchid, those flowers that marked her birthday and the club's namesake. "I can't believe you've done all this," Sam smiled, enclosing both her parents in a hug, her beautiful face lighting up with a wide smile. "It's perfect. Thank you." "Happy birthday, sweetheart," Len said. planting a kiss on his daughter's forehead. "How does it feel to be 30?
"Old," Sam laughed.
"A photo of all three of you, please," the photographer asked, gesturing in Sam's direction. Len, Gloria and Sam turned towards the camera, flashbulbs exploding as other photographers bustled into place to catch the moment. Len kissed Gloria on the cheek. "I'll be back shortly."
"Where are you going?"
Gloria asked, her fingers itching to keep hold of his tuxedo sleeve.
"It's Sam's birthday."
"John needs a quick word, but I won't be long. I promise." Gloria watched Len stride towards John Maynard standing at the brightly illuminated bar before turning her attention back to her daughter. Tom Bedworth shoved the remains of a microwaved burger into his mouth as he left the late-night cafe. He could have really done with something more substantial, like his usual egg and chips. This place wasn't skimpy on the chips, and they always chucked in some bread and butter as well. But tonight he had a thirst on, so he just grabbed something to go. Skirting around a couple arguing on the pavement, he haphazardly crossed the road at the Horsefair roundabout, narrowly avoiding getting clipped by the back end of a double-decker. Reaching the other side of the road, he hesitated, contemplating whether to return to the Aurora first. Shrugging, he continued to the gun barrels. The Aurora could wait. Yanking open the stiff door of the pub, Tom walked into the tap room, his ears immediately assaulted by the raucous chatter and tinny music blasting from the jukebox. Grinning, he sauntered up to the bar. "Evening, Dave. The usual, please." Dave pulled a pint glass from a shelf under the wooden bar and held it under the Carling tap. "Back again?" he laughed. "Thought you'd called it a night when you buggered off nigh on half an hour ago." "Nah," Tom winked. "Just needed some grub. I'm only having a couple more and meeting Jock." "Is he in yet?" "Jock? No, not yet," Dave replied, placing Tom's pint on the brass drip tray. Picking up the pint, Tom scowled as he leant in a pool of lager on the sticky bar top. He pulled his cigarettes from his pocket and glanced around. It never hurt to keep his eyes open for suitable contenders. He needed a good range of women for the punters to choose from. They couldn't all be Oriental birds, and that was all Jock had managed to get on the books so far. They might be as cheap as chips, but he wanted variety, choice. Classy birds, too. He wanted to provide just as much eye candy as the places he would shortly be wiping off the map. But wasn't that what, amongst other things, he paid Jock for, to sort the wheat from the chaff and make sure that side of the business ticked over nicely? That had been the point of looking the man up again, hadn't it? To help put his plan into motion. But on the whole, everything was going well. Despite being off the scene for 3 decades, Tom found his native accent flowed without having to try too hard, and it had been pleasantly straightforward digging out the word on the street. It had been a bit of a gamble, after all this time. Birmingham was a big place, but picking this side of town was purposeful. His flutter had paid off, and it hadn't taken long to locate people he knew of old who were still in the business. Some he'd been able to accost for favours, and others he'd pulled into work on his behalf, like Jock Sawyer, which enabled him to quickly step back into the game. It was amazing what flashing the cash did around these parts, and he had enough of that, at least at the moment. Now he'd established a good supplier, he could encroach on some of the better-known dealing patches. That part was most important, because it was a vital stage of his game plan, which was already well underway. Tom's eyes glistened with excitement. After all this time, all this bloody time of sitting on his hands, waiting for enough time to pass since the first fuck-up, it had finally arrived. This time, he was not ballsing up. This time, there would be no mistakes, and he would get a proper payout. He would not be ripped off again. Furthermore, he would recoup every single penny of interest he would have accrued had he been given his proper dues in the bloody first place. This time, he would take everything. Chapter 3. John Maynard tried really hard not to let the resentment seep out of his brain onto his face. He didn't know why he was even bothering passing the message on, because Len wouldn't be interested. Not today, anyway. Nothing could ever take precedence over his cousin Samantha's birthday. It never had done and never would. Even if the world was on fire, it would have to wait until her birthday was over. He looked at Len and scowled inwardly, seeing his concentration fixed through the one-way glass panel of the office, overlooking the main casino area below, no doubt on his daughter. I thought I should let you know straight away, even if you decide it's not worth considering. Len reluctantly pulled his eyes away from Samantha and slapped John on the shoulder. No, you were right to tell me. I was just thinking. John pursed his lips, thinking about whether Samantha's champagne was chilled enough. That would be the first thing he would do when he finally got the reins to this place. No more birthday bashes for Samantha Reynold. Ever. Len eyed John sadly. I'm also aware that as well as Sam's birthday, it's the anniversary of the day your father was taken. I don't know whether I've ever told you, or whether you'd guessed, but that's partly the reason I keep these birthday bashes going. John swallowed hard. He hadn't expected that, and an unexpected lump formed in his throat. Let's have a toast. Len walked to the drinks cabinet and poured out 2 shots of whiskey, handing one to John. Here's to Jimmy's memory, my best pal, and to my girl, Sam. Cheers, John muttered, chucking the whiskey down his throat. Len placed his now empty glass on his desk. Now, tell me more about this message from Stoker. There wasn't a lot said. The eldest son came in. John sniffed. The aloof bastard. You know the one. He said Mal wants to meet ASAP. Something to do with the Aurora? Len frowned. The what? That casino, Doss House, whatever it is that's open down the arse end of the Hagley Road. Len raised his eyebrows. Oh, I heard something about that. What the hell have they got to do with anything? They're hardly encroaching on our doorstep, and from what I've heard, aren't likely to either. He grinned. I don't think we need to worry that any of our customers will favour there instead of here, do you? John shrugged. No, I don't. But it seems they're getting fly by sending out scouts to tout their business on our patches, as well as on the Stokers. Word is they've been threatening runners. Len's eyes narrowed. Our runners? No one threatened people on his payroll apart from him, and then only with good reason. His staff from the bottom to the top were equally important to him, and always have been. John shook his head. Not as far as I know, but I'm planning on finding out. Len nodded. I'll put in a call to arrange the meet with Stoker. He glanced back down over the casino. We'll keep this to ourselves for now. I don't want anything spoiling Sam's night. John nodded resentfully. Of course. Nothing could be allowed to spoil anything for Samantha. Besides, it was hardly likely anything would be mentioned to her anyway. She had fuck all to do with this place and never would. Still looking down over the main casino, Lem frowned. Is that him? The Stoker boy? John walked over to the glass and peered down, seeing Sebastian Stoker leaning against the bar like he owned it. Yeah, that's him. Arrogant bastard. I told him to take a drink, though. Thought it only right. Len nodded. Yes, good. It never hurts to have manners, and he had the decency to bring the message. Right, I'll best get back down there before Gloria strings me up for disappearing on Sam's birthday. Tom laughed loudly. Jock's joke about the monkey tickling him no end. He slugged down most of his latest pint in one go, some escaping his mouth and spraying over his open packet of pork scratchings. Finally catching his breath, he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Fuck me, Jock. That's a good one. I'll have to remember that. Jock Sawyer grinned. The joke wasn't even funny, but it didn't take much to make Tom laugh. Not when he was in this state. But then Tom's unexpected return to Birmingham was a bit of good luck. After recently having his hours cut from the Rover factory in Longbridge, it had been a godsend when Tom offered to recoup his diminished wages with a few nice little earners. It was just like the old days, except this time around, Tom had gone up in the world with his gaff on the Hagley Road. All Jock had to do, apart from test ride women, which was never a hardship, was filched some business from the pushers in certain patches. He'd been surprised at the cut Tom was offering. It was a decent wedge. Easy money. That was until he'd cottoned on to whose patches were required. But it made little difference to him, as long as he didn't get dragged into it. Jock eyed Tom, unsure how much of this the man would remember. "Getting back to business. We've made headway with 2 of the patches you wanted." Tom signalled to the barman for another pint, then, closing one eye to reduce the 3 copies of the ashtray swimming around his blurred vision, stubbed his cigarette out. He smiled, pleased to hit the target. "That's good to hear, Jock. Good to hear. Keep on with it and ramp up the pressure. This is just the start." Jock's face grew concerned. "The firms know we're treading on their toes. Word is they're putting the feelers out. Their runners must have reported back our threats." Tom flapped his hand. "You mean your threats? Ah, but I know you won't let any of that old bollocks bother you." He made to slap Jock on the shoulder, but his drunkenness caused him to miss, and instead whack Jock in the chest. "Hard as nails you are, jockey boy." Jock grinned. That much was true. He wasn't a soft touch, and doubly good with his fists, and, come to mention it, any other weapon that came to hand. But there was a limit. "You're stepping on the Reynolds and Stoker's toes here, Tom," he said cautiously, his voice guarded. "Fuck Stoker and Reynold," Tom yelled, his hand veering his pint in the air, lager slopping on both the table as well as Jock's arm. Jock glanced around uncomfortably. Was Tom trying to get them both killed? "Keep your voice down, mate," he hissed. "We don't want any undue attention." "They're not all that, you know," Tom slurred, his voice still full volume. "I could tell you a few things about them fuckers that would make your hair curl." Jock tried to smile, but failed. There weren't many people around here that didn't know exactly what either of those firms would dish out when needed. "Shall we meet tracks?" he suggested. "We can discuss this another time." "Nah, I want to stay here. I've got a new pint on the way." Tom swung his head around to face the bar. "Come the fuck on, Dave. Where's me bloody drink?" He groped around the table for his cigarette packet. With fumbling fingers, he took out another cigarette and lit it. "Yeah, them lot. Fucking phonies. That's what they are." Jock stiffened. "Tom, I really don't think you—" "Cuckoos!" Tom roared, grinning widely as his fresh pint was deposited on the table. "What are you talking about?" Jock frowned. Finally, Tom found the sense to lower his voice. "One of them lot isn't one of them lot, if you get my drift." Jock sighed, getting frustrated. "Tom, I haven't got a clue what you're going on about." Tom grabbed Jock's shirt. "Mention that next time you put the pressure on the runners. Their bosses won't want folk to know that one of their kids isn't their own." Jock sat back, astounded. "Which? Who?" Tom grinned, a trail of dribble hanging from his mouth. "Never you mind, but just let it be known that everyone will learn of it if we don't get what we need." Jock sat back. Tom really was far too pissed. "How the fuck do you know this?" Tom cocked one eyebrow and smiled slowly. "Because, my man, one of those fuckers bought my kid, and a shit price they paid for it too." Chapter 4. Seb leant casually against the shiny black marble countertop of the bar. He didn't need to check that he hadn't inadvertently placed his arm in a pool of spilt beer or champagne, because the attentive bar staff ensured any spillage was immediately wiped up. The place was spotless. He had to take his hat off to Reynold. This place was the Dog's Danglers. Although it was years since he'd ventured inside the doors of this rival casino, it was the business since its most recent overhaul. That wasn't to say his father's place wasn't both sumptuous and glamorous. It was. But everyone knew Lem Reynold refreshed his decor on a 5-year cycle, making sure all the fixtures, fittings and upholstery were top-notch, up to date, and displayed no signs of wear or tear. And it showed. Never having diverted from the original colour scheme of purple, black, silver and white, the place oozed class on every level. It looked good. Really good. Seb raised his bottle of beer to his lips and assessed the admiring glances he was receiving from a healthy number of women around the large room. The talent here was hot too. No one could argue with that. He grinned as a slender woman with the deepest auburn hair. It was refreshing to see new faces, instead of the familiar selection at the Peacock. Not that anything was wrong with the women at the Peacock, he might add. Both his father's and Reynolds' clubs had a reputation across the whole city for their beauties, but the ones in the Orchard were a most welcome change of scenery. Seb was now glad he'd been the one to deliver the message. That part had been straightforward enough. With his morose face, it hadn't been difficult to spot John Maynard. Admittedly, in the handful of times Seb had met him, he'd never had much time for the man, but despite the bloke being miserable beyond words, with the added impediment of abruptness, at least he'd had the good grace to offer a drink on the house, so credit to him and Reynold for that. Aside from his reticence to give Reynold and his firm a heads up with the word on the street, Seb also knew it was prudent to stay on cordial terms, which included Maynard. It was common knowledge Maynard would eventually take over the running of the Orchid from Reynold, and being as his own line for taking over the Peacock was assured, it would be him dealing with Maynard at some point in the future. Signalling to the barman for a refill, Seb continued scanning the room, his eyes stopping suddenly on a brunette. This one was stunning, a real showstopper. Feeling his throat tighten with the vision of the woman's figure-hugging cream dress slithering to the floor, his teeth pulling at her lacy underwear, Seb took a lazy swig of his beer. Nice. Very nice. Seb grinned as the woman turned, her eyes meeting his across the expanse of people. She'd seen him. She must be able to sense his interest, and she wasn't looking away either. Game on. Placing his bottle on the bar, Seb tugged at his cuffs, making sure they protruded from his jacket just enough, and was about to make his way over when another man approached the stunner and placed an arm around her shoulders. That was Reynold. Seb frowned. It wasn't like Reynold to flaunt a bit on the side. The man was well known for being true to his wife. Everyone knew that. Wait. Holy fuck. That wasn't Reynolds' bit on the side. That was his daughter. Seb's heart geared up a notch. Samantha Reynold had clearly changed a hell of a lot since he'd last seen her, although it must be over 10 years, if not longer, since he'd last seen the girl. He didn't remember her being so drop-dead gorgeous. He watched Sam listening to whatever her father was saying and decided he'd make his way over to wish the girl a pleasant birthday regardless. After all, it was only polite, and he was nothing if not polite, at least when it suited him. Seb's plans were cut short when the music suddenly dropped and the voice of Len Reynolds boomed through the vast array of speakers. Good evening, ladies and gents. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Violet Orchid in celebration of my daughter Samantha's birthday. I also have an announcement to make. Seb leant against the bar and picked his beer back up, intrigued to hear what Reynolds was going to say. Then, after the man had said his bit, he'd resumed the plan to reintroduce himself to that damn fine-looking daughter of his. Sam inwardly cringed with embarrassment as her father spoke into the microphone. She glanced at her mother and raised her eyebrows, only to get a confused shrug in return. Taking his place by Sam's side, Liam whispered into her ear. What's all this about? No idea, Sam replied. It was unusual. In all the birthdays she'd had here, her father had never taken the mic, and there was a surprise too. Excitement bubbled. Trust her father to do something on top of the party. He never ceased to amaze her. Hey, maybe he's got you a cake with a hunky 6-foot male stripper inside. Liam laughed, although why you'd want that when you've got me? Sam was glad she couldn't respond to Liam's comment, as her father's voice continued, the volume drowning out further ability for conversation. Would she need to have that talk with Liam again? The one about being better off as friends? Suddenly, she felt horribly nervous. Oh God, this wasn't anything to do with Liam, was it? He hadn't arranged with her father to propose or something equally dreadful. Nerves fluttered and gained pace, causing a sudden urge to run from the room. Stiffening, she watched Liam from the corner of her eye, For an indication, he was about to be handed the microphone, then dropped to one knee. Oh, he wouldn't do that to her, would he? Not in front of all these people. "Please don't let him do this," she chanted silently. Feeling an intense stare burning into her, Sam glanced back across the room, seeing the man leaning against the bar. She'd noticed him a few minutes ago, and although too far away to see clearly, it distinctly felt like she knew him from somewhere. Try as she might, she couldn't put her finger on where or how she recognised him. There was something very striking and unusual about him, unnervingly so, and he was still staring at her, almost peeling away her layers. Unnerved and slightly uncomfortable, Sam turned back to Liam, fleetingly wondering whether she should ask if he knew who the distinctive stranger was. Thinking better of it, she instead smiled up at her father and joined the rest of the crowd, eagerly waiting in anticipation for his words. As long as her father wasn't in cahoots with Liam for an ad hoc and awkward marriage proposal, then any announcement or surprise would be acceptable. Seeing her father beckoning for her to join him, Sam frowned. "Come on, Samantha. Come up here a moment." Len's voice boomed through the microphone. Sam reluctantly climbed the steps up the raised dais to join her father and stared at the sea of people in front of her. She blushed, her legs becoming shaky, her comfort in the limelight only slightly better than her mother's. What was her father going to do? At least Liam wasn't rummaging in his pocket for an engagement ring, so thankfully it looked like that theory was unlikely. "I think most of you here tonight know how special my gorgeous daughter is to me," Len said, looking first at Sam and then at the crowd. "It's a family tradition to host these parties for Sam's birthday. The most important day of mine and my dear wife Gloria's lives," he continued. "But tonight, I'm breaking tradition by doing something that isn't usually done in my line of work." Sam frowned, utterly confused. Break tradition? Len smiled widely and turned to Sam. "I'm so very proud of you, my darling. You've proved yourself more than capable of everything you set your mind to do, and so," he turned to Gloria, "even my wife doesn't know about this, but I know she'll agree. I've made the decision that when I retire, Samantha will take over the business." At this, a collective gasp went up, followed by a round of loud applause. Sam blinked several times in succession. What had he just said? "Congratulations, Sam, my dearest," Len continued. "But don't get too excited. I've got no plans to step down and don my pipe and slippers for a long time yet." A good-natured laugh resounded from the crowd, then turned into another round of rapt applause and cheering, along with flashes from every corner of the room as the press captured the moment. Len hugged Sam and kissed her on both cheeks. "I wanted to give you something extra special as a surprise for your 30th, sweetheart. I hope it pleases you." "Thank you so much, Dad," Sam muttered, not knowing what else to say. "Champagne on the house for everyone," Len boomed, garnering another wild cheer and round of applause. Unable to stand it any longer, Sam hurried from the dais and made her way back to Liam, who greeted her with a glass of champagne. Taking the drink, panic set in. How could she inherit this casino and her father's business? She didn't want it. She had her own business planned. No, no, no. Why would he do this? She knew nothing about this sort of thing. "Wow, Sam," Liam cried, making sure he took the opportunity to slip his arm around Sam's waist. "That's amazing. You must be so pleased." "I never expected it, that's for sure," Sam replied, hoping the smile on her face looked genuine. Such was Sam's shock, she failed to notice the expression on John Maynard's face, or that the tall stranger who had been intently staring at her over by the bar had disappeared. Chapter 5. Leaning back in his leather desk chair, Mal inhaled deeply and stretched his back to relieve the tight pain in his chest, the ache spreading up into his neck. He massaged the back of his neck with his thick fingers in a bid to reduce the discomfort, but it was to no avail. This horrible, suffocating pain was occurring more and more frequently, no doubt triggered by the recent stress. Mal frowned. He didn't want a two-bit outfit such as the Aurora attempting to step on his toes and interfering with anything to do with his casino. Not that he knew much about the place. Short of, by all accounts, it was one of those seedy, shitty places with few morals and even less organisation. "Are you all right, Dad?" Gary asked, his face awash with concern, watching his father's face twist with pain. "What? Oh, yes, I'm fine," Mal replied, relaxing a little as the discomfort started to ebb away. "Just tense, that's all." "You should see a doctor if you're having problems," Gary continued, ignoring the warning looks from Andrew and Neil. "Since when does anyone need to see a quack because of a bit of fucking stress?" Mal barked, knowing he was getting on the defensive, but he couldn't and wouldn't let on to any of his sons that he was worried over the increasing amount of breathlessness and pain. He didn't have time to be ill, not while random scroats were digging around his patches. "And where's Sebastian?" he snapped. "I wanted the lowdown on what happened at the Orchid. Did he call any of you last night?" He frowned at the general shake of heads around the room. "Seb probably pulled, and he's still otherwise engaged." Neil winked in Andrew's direction. "I know I would have." "I think you'll find that wasn't the reason for my attendance," Seb said bluntly, as he walked into his father's office, shutting the door loudly behind him. "Although there were many delectable ladies present, I was distracted by what I heard." Mal folded his arms. "I'm not interested in idle gossip. All I want to know is whether you got my message to Reynold. Are we having a meet or what?" Seb eyed his father carefully. "Yes, message delivered to Maynard. He said he would pass it on." "I take it you didn't see Reynold yourself?" Mal asked. "I saw Reynold, but not to speak to. He was too busy," Seb continued, amused. Mal sighed. "If you've got a point to make, then just bloody make it, will you?" he snapped, rubbing at his neck once more. Seb grinned. "This idle gossip, as you so succinctly put it, is that Reynold has broken with tradition by making his daughter heir of his business." A heavy silence fell in the room, the men exchanging surprised glances. Mal rolled his eyes. "Where did you hear this pearl of wisdom?" "Reynold himself." Seb raised one eyebrow cockily. Mal sat back in his chair and rubbed his hand across his chin in confusion. "Reynold has handed his business to his daughter. Are you sure?" "That's what he said, and being as he announced it over the mic, it was pretty clear. A birthday surprise for Samantha, apparently." Mal shook his head in bemusement. Then his eyebrows knitted together. Reynold, only having the one kid, the girl, wasn't much use where firms like theirs came to pass, so it was always assumed Maynard would inherit the reins when it was time. "Reynold is retiring?" Seb shook his head. "Not any time soon. He made that clear." Andrew blew through his teeth. "Well, that'll be a turn-up for the books, if it ever comes to pass, that is. I wonder what Maynard thinks about this." "From what I saw, he wasn't best pleased, but it's no skin off our nose." Seb grinned. "In fact, the sooner Reynold retires, the better. If a woman with no experience of the industry is holding the reins, we're bound to increase our sway. For us, it will be a win-win situation." The shrill bell of Mal's desk...